Hello, and welcome back to AP Environmental Science. Today I want to talk about agriculture. So what is agriculture? Basically, it's growing crops or raising livestock and then dealing with that food. Maybe that is for you, for your own family, maybe that is to take to market. But ultimately, whatever's happening around the world today, about 50% of the world's labor force is employed in agriculture. And when we start looking at the least developed countries, obviously that number is going to be a lot higher. For instance, in sub-Saharan Africa, you're looking at 60%. But as you start getting into more developed nations, you can see that really it's a very small percentage of the population involved actually in agriculture, which is interesting because so much more food is actually produced. And if you look at this graph, you'll see that the population we know has consistently gone up, and grain population took a little hitch here, but then it went back up, and so it's kept pace with the population. But one thing that's interesting about this graph is that meat production has increased considerably more than either the population or the grain. So why has meat production increased so much more than grain production since 1970? Is it because a more affluent population demands more meat? We finally have enough grain to feed all the livestock and the people? It hasn't really increased. Or animals reproduce very quickly. Well, it turns out that the world across the board has become more affluent since 1970. And so a more affluent population demands more meat. As people have just more disposable income, they want higher protein sources, and meat will do that. So when you look at the history of mankind, you can see that about 10,000 years ago, globally, we are engaged in agriculture. And we have samples that go back as much as 15,000 years. But whatever dates and evidence you're looking at, we are doing subsistence agriculture with crops that we are domesticating. We are transitioning from the wild type to very specific plants that we are breeding, that we are cultivating, right? And by 10,000 years ago, we have global agriculture, essentially. Now, one of the things that's always been true historically is that crops are dependent on microclimates. And so you can really only grow what will grow in the area in which you live, right? So subsistence agriculture is the traditional agricultural methods. You still see it today in developing countries, and people are raising food for their families. So based on this idea of microclimates, small farms growing enough food for family and some for trade, right? We're talking about people that are specifically dependent on the labor force that they have. It's very labor intensive, and the land that's available to them. Okay, so they're going to grow whatever is available. They're going to all be employed in agriculture, and they're going to use the land that's available to them. So what this results in is typically what we call polyculture. And polyculture is the growing of lots of crops or different crops altogether. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. All right. Now, one of the things that you also see in developing countries recently, taking that idea of subsistence agriculture and growing what's available, using the microclimate, whatever's available to you. In developing countries, we will see this idea of shifting cultivation. You grow crops and then you leave the land alone. And what we're really talking about is slash and burn agriculture. In slash and burn agriculture, forests are cleared out. They are typically tropical rainforests. Crops will be grown in those areas because the fire leaves ash that puts nutrients into the soil. But as we know, tropical rainforest soils are poor. They're very poor because most of the nutrients are locked up in the trees themselves, and so that soil is not a reservoir for the nutrients, thinking about biogeochemical cycles. So that means that the soils will lose their productivity very, very quickly, and so you can really only support small populations with this slash and burn agriculture, the shifting cultivation. This, by the way, is different than crop rotation. If you are familiar with crop rotation, that is where you would grow a crop in one part of your farm and then the next season you would grow it in another part of your farm, and then you would grow a different crop. So like cotton, right? So maybe you grow cotton in one part of your field, and then you shift that cotton to another part of the field the next season, because cotton really strips the soil of nutrients. It's a very needy crop. But in its place, you would grow something that would replenish the soil, like corn. And so you would just keep shifting, and then in the third part of your field, you may leave that open for the season so it can just rest, the soil can rest, and then you'll grow corn and then cotton and then rest, and then corn and then cotton and then rest, right? And so that's crop rotation. Shifting cultivation, you just abandon the land because it's not productive anymore. Okay, and when you look around the world, you can see that shifting cultivation is a very big trend in areas where you have these developing countries in and subsistence agriculture. Now, as you move into the grasslands that border the tropical rainforest, you're going to see a lot of nomadic herding. And then when you start looking into developed nations, you're going to see industrialized agriculture, which we will talk about in just a minute. All right, so when we think about modern agriculture and what's going on, we see a big shift after World War II. Right? So why is there an increase in technology after World War II? Is it because people had more time to farm? People were more interested in finding better ways to farm? Technology developed in the war could be transitioned to agriculture and lots of other things, or is it just coincidence? World War II produced lots of technologies to include things like explosives, right? Mechanized vehicles. You could transition those two things, explosives, nitrogen-based explosives, nitrates, ammonium nitrate, into fertilizers. So munitions, explosives factories could become fertilizer factories. Tanks and all of those things, you could re-outfit those factories to become tractor factories, right? And other farming equipment. And so there was a lot of technology developed for the war that could actually be transitioned into other fields. So C is the answer. So after World War II, we see this shift in technology, but we also see a change in what people can grow, right? And so we start in the 50s and 60s. Research begins after World War II, but we start seeing something called the Green Revolution. And the Green Revolution is a movement in farming where you have new chemical inputs, highly selective breeding of crops, and high input cultivation methods with a dependence on complex machinery. Okay, so when we look at the Green Revolution, this is very important. The Green Revolution saved people's lives. It temporarily closed the gap between food production and population. Right? So as population is growing and food production isn't, you're ending up with starvation. And so a couple of geneticists got together and started breeding wheat. There are also Green Revolution versions of corn and rice, but ultimately they start with wheat because wheat has some real problems. So Norman Borlaug, that's this man right here, who won a Nobel Prize for this actually, starts researching with making wheat that you could grow quickly and would be hardy and would do very well, and he starts this in Mexico. And then he actually introduces the crops in the 1960s, and now they're everywhere, by the way. So when we talk about the Green Revolution, we talk about starting with wheat. Traditional wheat has a lot of pests, viruses, rust, for instance, and it has a problem called lodging. And lodging is where the little wheat berries, right, these guys right here, fold over and go into the ground. And that is the way wheat actually is evolved to behave, because that is what makes baby wheat, right? Because the wheat that we eat is the baby wheat. Well, we don't want it to make baby wheat. We want to harvest it and we want to eat it. So they created a product called semi-dwarf wheat, and this came out in 1962. It is too short, it doesn't lodge, but it produces lots of wheat, and it is resistant to rust. And this is great. So they're getting higher yields partly because they're putting in lots of fertilizer and lots of pesticides. And it was very successful, and it eventually expanded into Pakistan and India in the late 60s. And so you start to see this shift from the traditional polyculture, subsistence agriculture, to this big kind of industrial monoculture. And there are huge environmental impacts of the Green Revolution, but part of the positive impact is that you have lots and lots more grain production. Now, here's the catch though. When you look at world grain production per capita, it's a straight line. So grain goes up, but per capita, right, does not. So why has the per capita grain production not increased with the Green Revolution? The technology was not that successful, the world's population got bigger, the grain supply was destroyed by pests, natural disasters, and conflict, or coincidence? Well, the population kept growing. So as grain production increased, so did the population. So the positive side is that grain production matched population increase. And so you didn't have any sort of decrease. You didn't have a gap anymore, right? And that's great. Now, on this list of environmental impact of the Green Revolution, you have this positive thing where you prevent people from starving. Yay. But there are some downsides to it too. You get monocultures. They are high input, lots of water, lots of fertilizer, lots of pesticide. So in a nutshell, lots of water, lots of chemicals. Now, over time, the yields have not increased anymore, right? We're putting in more water, more fertilizer, more pesticide, but we're not getting any increase in yield, and in some cases we actually get a decrease in yields because of resistance that has occurred over time to pests, right? So pesticides. Pests are becoming more resistant to pesticides because they've been exposed to them, evolution, right? And so they attack crops. Now, we'll talk about pesticides in particular in class. I'll give you a little conversation about that. Now, the other thing about pesticides is they do bioaccumulate and they do biomagnify, and again, we talk about that more in class. The pesticide residue sometimes is in the food, and there are non-target organism deaths. So when we start thinking about the specific environmental impact of the Green Revolution, a lot of the things related to that impact deal with pesticides, which is why we're going to take that separately. Okay, so basically when we have the Green Revolution, we start really thinking about industrialized agriculture. And when we talk about industrialized agriculture, we're talking about the modern agricultural methods. That is going to be the Green Revolution methods. We are doing this in developed countries. The inputs, unlike in subsistence agriculture where it was labor and land, we're going to see that you need money, you need energy, you need chemicals. Now, the benefit, though, is that you get much higher yields than you do in subsistence farming. One of the downsides is it's marked by monoculture. Okay, about 80% of the world's food supply is actually produced by industrial agriculture. And so that means that we're using lots and lots of water, chemicals, energy, right, all that stuff. Now, right, we also start to see different kinds of industrial food production. We're seeing greenhouses and we're seeing plantations for cash crops. And so those are kind of specialized farms that have their own issues. And if we have time, we will talk specifically about them. But if not, just know that you've got your sort of traditional modern industrial farms, and then you have these two specialty farms. All right, so when we look at food production, biodiversity loss, soil quality decrease, water usage and water pollution, air pollution, and then human health issues. So take a look at this list. I'm not going to read it to you. We'll talk about a couple of them over the course of several conversations. But this is a lot of stuff that goes with food production. And the bad thing is we can't just stop producing food. We need food. All right, so what are the challenges? First, we need to improve yields, right? The Green Revolution was great, and we did great stuff with that, but food per capita has remained the same, right? We need to double the green revolution in order to be successful. And while we double the green revolution, we also have to curb the environmental impacts. And that is a very difficult thing to do, because some of the things that are happening now are we're losing prime farmland to suburban sprawl. And this is bad for a couple of reasons. One, it infringes on food production. But two, croplands used to be grasslands and forests, and so they will give us the same ecological services that we got with grasslands and forests, which you can see here and we'll continue to talk about, but they also give us the economic services that sprawl does not. Okay. Now, some other challenges that we see because of that monoculture, you have a loss of domestic variety, right? We get a loss of genetic diversity because modern methods are all about maximum production, and that has to do with growing the same crop, right? If you're growing the same crop, you don't have to specialize. It takes less time, it takes less money because you can buy all the same stuff and do all the same stuff at the same time. So think about bananas, right? You have these Cavendish bananas. This is what we eat. Great. But in reality, there are lots of different kinds of bananas. And yet we only see the one because monoculture, right? Now, there's been a big movement to recover domestic varieties of stuff, right? And so here you can see there's a big trend for heirloom vegetables. Here are heirloom melons, here are heirloom tomatoes, and then here are just some random heirloom stuff, beans, cauliflower, right? And so this is a big trend, and you'll see this in grocery stores. You'll see this in sort of hobby gardeners, right? Organic farms. And it's not just plants, it's animals as well. And there's an important benefit to the recovery of these multitude of domestic varieties, and that is genetic variety. Remember that if you have all the same banana, right? If a virus comes, then all the bananas get wiped out. If you have a lot of different kinds of bananas and a virus comes, then you may lose one type of banana, but you have all the other bananas, and you can crossbreed because you sort of have a bank of genes that you can access to recover other species, and that's a really important thing. And so that's actually led to a trend in farming that we're starting to see now that's called intercropping, and this is where you grow a variety of crops in the same field. Typically it's polyculture, where you have different crops that are planted together. One of the big trends here too is to pick plants that mature at different times, and so you are constantly harvesting and you can replace those crops. So let's say that I'm growing kale in one part of my field and I'm growing beans in another part of my field. Well, maybe the kale matures at a different time than the beans, and that's great. So now I have two different foods, but then after the beans are harvested, then maybe I can plant something else there that's going to grow in the next season, and so I can constantly have something growing, meaning you can not only have sort of different harvest times, but you can actually harvest different crops for both of those reasons. Now, the other thing that you'll see is polyvarietal cultivation, and this is where you're planting several genetic varieties. So polyculture is about different crops. I'm going to grow cucumbers and basil and tomatoes, right? All in the same plot. In polyvarietal, it just means that I'm going to grow beefeater tomatoes and Cherokee Purple and Golden Queen and, black cherry, right? I'm going to grow, but they're all tomatoes. So that's just a little bit about intercropping, and we take it a step further nowadays in something called agroforestry. And agroforestry is where you are growing a crop and a tree crop together. So here you have trees, and then here you have your crop, which in this case is corn. The great thing about agroforestry is that you can use the land really well, but the trees will act as windbreaks and they will protect the crop that you have there. It also allows you to allows for a lot of different things that we can talk about later. Okay, now let's talk about industrialized food production, specifically in the United States. We make lots and lots and lots of food. We use almost 20% of commercial energy use in agricultural endeavors, right? Whether it is the crops and livestock, or it's the food processing or the distribution and preparation. ultimately, it takes about 10 units of non-renewable fossil fuel energy to put 1 unit of food energy on the table. And that's kind of a lot, right? And it's something we want to think about. In the United States, food will travel an average of 2,400 kilometers from farm to plate. And partly that's because we import lots of things from around the world. Because one of the things that we like to have here in the United States is access to everything that we want. And we can get that. And that's really great. And there's an environmental cost to it. So which of the following is not a way in which food production impacts the environment? It increases salt buildup in soils, it increases soil erosion, it decreases biodiversity, it increases surface water quality. Well, it certainly does not increase surface water quality. As a matter of fact, it decreases it. So 4 is the answer. It decreases surface water quality, decreases biodiversity, because remember that monoculture thing, and we're taking out wild spaces and replacing them with monoculture crops. It does increase soil erosion because of all the irrigation, and irrigation also causes salt buildup in soils, which we'll talk about in a second. Now, I've put this slide in here for you to kind of get just a summary of the stuff that we have been talking about. I want you to think about these, know at least 2 from each category, right? And make sure that you understand them. And again, some of these we've talked about, some of them we will talk about in the future. But really quickly, let's address 2 things, irrigation and fertilizer, because remember, industrial agriculture, modern agriculture, is high water and high chemical input, and I told you we talk about pesticides separately. But irrigation, we need rain to make crops grow. We don't always get the rain, so we're going to pull water out. There are 3 main irrigation systems. There is a gravity flow, where you essentially flood the field. It's sometimes called flood irrigation. You have a sprinkler system. Typically it's that center pivot where you have these sprinklers and they go around on a machine and they make these lovely circles. You've seen them. And then drip irrigation is the best out of all of them. Now the reason that drip irrigation is the best of all of these is because it actually wastes the least amount of water. Gravity or flood irrigation, sometimes called furrow irrigation, this wastes an amazing amount of water. This is the oldest type of irrigation. We've been doing this for thousands of years. But which of the following is not one of the major problems with flood irrigation? Decrease in soil quality due to leaching of nutrients, increase in surface water quality due to fertilizer enrichment from field runoff, salinization of the soil as standing water evaporates, crop losses due to root rot from standing water, or no problems, it's the best choice. Well, again, we keep talking about all of these things degrade surface water quality. So B is the answer. It is not right, something that happens. This statement is false. You do not have surface water quality, right, because of fertilizers. As a matter of fact, fertilizers cause eutrophication, right? The water also pulls nutrients out of the soil and washes them away. That's another problem with runoff in general. Now, as that water in the field sits there, some of it is going to evaporate off and it's going to leave the salt in it behind, and that results in salinization of the fields. And if that water ends up not evaporating or infiltrating, then it just stands there and you can actually lose your crop due to what we call root rot because it rots in the water. So why would you do this? Well, it's inexpensive, there's very little labor, and it controls a big pest, especially for grain crops, rats, right? So rodents, mice, all of those guys. Disadvantage, you have to have the right angle of the land or the water won't flow. It uses huge amounts of water. You get that salinization and water loss through evaporation. You can get fungus, mold, and water rot because, standing water. And you get that eutrophication, you get sediment buildup, and of course you get pesticides in your runoff. Sprinkler irrigation is better in a lot of ways. It is typically used in more arid regions because you don't have a lot of surface water, you don't have a lot of rain, which is one of the following is not one of the major problems with sprinkler irrigation. Higher energy use because of sprinkler machinery and motors, water loss due to evaporation before the water reaches the ground, salinization as the water evaporates off the ground, or increased pest problems due to less water usage. No problems, it's the best choice. Well, you don't actually have increased pest problems due to less water usage. That's actually not a thing. That's not a thing. So D is not a thing, right? Salinization, same as flood, right? Water loss, as you sprinkle the water down, it actually evaporates off, right? And you have to run the sprinkler's machinery, right? And that's going to take energy. So advantages, why would you do it if it's got problems? It is less water. That's great. It's more precise. You can put the water where you want it. And that's great. So you may actually get less runoff, and you don't have to contour the land. You can kind of use it sort of wherever you want. Disadvantage, you have to have all that equipment. It has to be installed and it has to be maintained, so it's expensive. You still get salinization, and when it's windy or hot, you lose a lot of water to evaporation. All right, what's the best choice? Micro irrigation. It's also called trickle or drip irrigation. And you can see here it has some systems where it's going to pump water into pipes or tubes, and those will be put across every row, right? So here you get drip lines. Sometimes you can get like tiny little hoses that you can run through trees. Sometimes you can actually have where you have pipes, and then you'll have the lines going through there, and then sometimes you can actually do it under the ground if you have deep roots. But ultimately what's very standard is to just kind of have these little drip lines, whether they're above or on the ground. You just have the water seeping out of these lines. The advantage is you use way less water. It's super efficient, like 80 to 90% efficient. Very precise, and you can apply fertilizer in a very precise way, which means you need less of it, and that's great. The disadvantages are it is amazingly expensive, and you need lots and lots and lots of equipment, especially if you have a really big farm. So it's a huge disadvantage, right? But environmentally speaking, it is the best choice of the three. Economically speaking, it is the worst choice of the three. All right, so where do we get irrigation water? Easy. Wells, we drill for it. Rivers, we pull it out of the river, or we have water that's provided from large water sources like lakes and reservoirs. Those are called irrigation districts, by the way. All right, salinization. Remember I told you that we get that salt buildup? The best thing to do with this is to prevent it. You can do that by reducing irrigation, by using drip irrigation, or you can, once the soil has the salt buildup, you're going to have to switch to salt-tolerant crops, right? Now, how do you clean it up? You can flush the soil, but you'll lose all the nutrients. It's extremely expensive, and it wastes a lot of water. You can stop growing crops for 2 to 5 years and let the land sit and let the salt wash out naturally. But you're not growing anything. Or you can install underground drainage systems and flush some water into it and then just kind of keep pulling the salt out. Those drainage systems will prevent salinization going forward as well, but that's amazingly expensive. All right, let's switch to our next input. Fertilizer. It's what makes plants grow. The big 3 things that every plant needs are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And that goes back to the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles that we've been talking about. Why do plants need nitrogen and phosphorus anyway? This little review. Nitrogen is a major building block of amino acids and nitrogenous bases. Phosphorus is the building block of the DNA scaffold. Phosphorus is important for photosynthesis. Nitrogen is essential in respiration, or none of these. Well, there are actually 2 answers here. That is that nitrogen is the major building block of amino acids and nitrogenous bases, hence the nitrogenous part. And then phosphorus is in phosphate, which is the building block of the DNA scaffold. So A and B are the answer to this one. We need fertilizers, plants need it, and we have to apply it. Typically, we use inorganic commercial fertilizers because they are easy to transport, easy to store, easy to apply, and they are extremely effective, right? The disadvantages are they don't add anything to the soil. They can actually damage soil in many ways. They cause eutrophication, and they need lots of energy to produce, right? Because remember, you have to mine that phosphorus, for instance. So all kinds of issues with that. Now, interestingly enough, worldwide fertilizer use has just increased. We put down about I have to look at, I'm sorry, I totally just lost the number in my mind, but we've increased fertilizer used like 33 times, like 33-fold since the Green Revolution, but yields are not going up, right, the way that they should in relation to that, because you can't, it doesn't matter, after a certain point, it doesn't matter how much fertilizer you put down, right, that's it. You can't get any, plants can't absorb any more, and too much will actually burn them. So that's a real problem, right? Okay. So we will talk about pesticides later. We'll continue talking about how do we deal with these high input crops? What are some alternatives to that? What are some alternatives to traditional farming? And so those are going to be the conversations going forward. Ultimately, the U.S. produces a massive amount of grain, and we use industrialized agriculture to do it. We produce about 20% of the world's grain, and we feed lots of other countries doing it. We're very efficient at it, but it's got a high environmental cost for us. And that, again, is going to be the focus of this unit, developing agriculture methods and developed agricultural methods. All right, that is it. If you have any questions, please ask me at the beginning of class, and I will know we did a lot of information today. Sorry about that, but it's a lot of information. All right, I will see you next time. Thanks for listening.